So let me welcome you to the keynote lecture by Elke Schwarz. The title of the lecture is The Hacker Way, Moral Decision-Making Logics with Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems. And we're very honored that Elke has agreed to speak at our keynote tonight. Elke is Associate Professor in Political Theory at Queen Mary University, London. Her research focuses on the intersection of ethics of war and technology, and she's emphasizing their unmanned, autonomous, or intelligent military technologies and their impact on the politics of contemporary warfare. Elke is really one of the first, I think, sophisticated theoretical voices in this debate, at least to my knowledge. I've been reading her stuff for a long time, and also has written a very, very sophisticated and critical book on the topic called Death Machines, the Ethics of Violent Technologies, which I can only highly recommend. And contrary to maybe some of the more theoretically inclined of us, Elke has also been involved in the policy side of this debate, for example, through being a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. Next year, Elke will have the opportunity to be a fellow at the University of Heidelberg as part of the Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies. Yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing your talk now, Elke, and to the thoughts you're going to share with us. Elke will speak for about kind of 30 minutes, and then we will go into Q&A. And I would ask you all to just put your questions in the Q&A, sorry, in the chat, and then I hope we will have a really interesting discussion after what I'm sure will be a very interesting lecture. So Elke, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ingvild, for the generous and kind introduction, and of course the kind invitation to speak to you all this afternoon. It really truly is an honor, so thank you. I'm hoping to keep to 30 minutes, but it might be more 40 minutes. I'll do my very best. I know it's already been a long day of really rich discussions, so thank you all for tuning in once more at this hour. It's, of course, it goes without saying, but it is a feature of our time that I just want to highlight that it would have been great to see and meet you all in person in Denmark, but it is also wonderful to have the opportunity to connect here in the virtual realm with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and have a very small, short presentation to accompany the talk. So I hope you can see this. Yes? Okay, good. So this, well, the last 5 years, but this time in particular is a good time to be talking about the role of algorithms in security and warfare as the pace of new military products and systems that hit the market reach the market at record speed, while discussions on legally binding instruments to curb AI-enabled lethal weapons, especially autonomous systems, have stalled, at least at the latest meetings of the group of governmental experts on laws at the UN in Geneva. I've been really and truly impressed today by the excellent, varied and thorough engagement each of the papers has provided on this first day of the conference, and I feel really encouraged that collectively we are making at least a good effort to provide incisive analysis that can keep pace with the speed of technological military innovation, even if policy is still lagging behind. And it is really great to hear perspectives from a range of disciplines. Always fascinating. I think it's really important to keep an interdisciplinary conversation going. It's always challenging, which in this instance, I think is a very good thing. As ever, my comments are underpinned by concern for our human tapestry and our ethics for and in warfare. Today, I will take a slightly different angle and zoom out a little bit as I focus on two aspects. The first one will be an engagement with the wider logic with which military autonomous or intelligent technologies not only shape ideas and practices of violence, but also how the ethos and business practices of the technology sector aim or seek to transform military operations in its own image, and doing so in ways that obscures ethical possibilities or ethical reasoning. And the second part, I will very briefly try to illustrate how this logic shifts the value of human life into quite a perilous space of an inevitable accident an accident, as the excess of innovation, perhaps a new mode of collateral damage that remains largely invisible in the moral calculus of future algorithmic war. Now, for those of you that are familiar with my work on autonomous technologies and moral agencies, you know that I am always a little bit frustrated that discussions on military artificial intelligence, especially in policy circles, and especially those discussions that center on AI for lethal military operations, tend to work with quite a limited understanding or idea of ethics. And they also tend to prioritize quite an instrumentalist view of how humans work with or fit within digital environments and digital ecologies. And this often goes hand in hand with what I find somewhat perplexing fascination with and focus on the specific technical aspects and capabilities of these technologies and their surroundings. And indeed, I find that while the capabilities are often overhyped and overpromised, the human factor is equally often overlooked in these discussions. And given the wider logic of algorithmic technologies and artificial intelligence, the assumption that we can just simply use and control AI technology, make it affect our intents as a tool would do, however much sophisticated these AI systems might be, or however much they can be refined. I find this assumption ill-placed, but I also find it a little bit naive and indeed quite dangerous. Just a little bit of context. In my previous work, I have focused on the question of human moral agency and have argued that the characteristics of the technology itself pose a considerable challenge to our ethical reasoning or capabilities of reasoning. And this also includes the possibility to exert meaningful human control. And in my work, I have explored how meaningful human control, as it relates to moral agency, remains a chimera or an impossibility perhaps within the parameters of accelerated algorithmic warfare. And I've been more recently concerned also with how the very logic of digital interfaces and specifically also infrastructures direct ethical thinking in line with the schematics, if you will, of digital protocols. And again, in this process, ethical deliberations often sidelined altogether. So this is the point I want to build on a little bit this evening by zooming out a bit further to look at what Jacques Ellul called technique, as it relates specifically to the military sector, the technology sector, and artificial intelligence. There are always various ways in which we can theorize these concerns with military human-machine systems. There's no shortage of really interesting and fascinating voices. Usually my go-to theorist is the still underappreciated Günther Anders, but today I'd like to frame my thoughts by drawing on another early thinker of cyber technology, the so-called father of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, who wrote in the 1950s and 60s, and he has raised in his work precisely the questions that we're grappling with respect to the military human-machine interfaces and the standing of these agencies, the machine agency, human agency, in relation to one another for decision-making about matters that affect humanity. So for him, for Norbert Wiener, that is, thinking through what effects cyber technologies might have on our shared world, especially those technologies that alleviate us of making difficult decisions. For him, that was a moral question of the highest order. And his book, The Human Use of Human Beings, first published in 1950, depicted here, is really worth exploring for a better understanding of the current military AI hype as actually quite detrimental to wider human society or the aims of human society. And it may, or quite likely actually, possibly may not surprise you to hear that in the early days of cybernetics, the idea that artificial intelligence would make a substantial contribution to the practice of warfare in ways that might prove more than challenging actually was already articulated by some of the pioneers of cybernetics, and Norbert Wiener was among the most vocal skeptics about the ostensible benefits of increased automation for and in warfare. So he takes the human and human affairs quite seriously, even though he's a mathematician, And he was presciently clear that a considerable danger resides in the possibility of the slick logic of machines coming to serve to amplify the power of a few, wielded with a machine-like rationality over the many. And so even though he was a scientist of technology and a mathematician or mathematical thinker, he was very much ill at ease with the increasingly prevalent perspective, which viewed technology, and here I quote, not so much as an applied science, but rather as an applied social and moral philosophy. In other words, he saw that the logic of computation and information technology was fast becoming a dominant mode of philosophical reasoning and was set to shape our normative questions and our ethical thinking in significant ways, including in warfare. And he was not alone at the time. Louis Mumford, a couple of decades earlier, and Jacques Ellul and others, Günther Anders as well, have made similar observations right around the same time about technology and modern society. And I think it's worthwhile really taking those voices seriously, and specifically Norbert Wiener's voice for me chimes from the very foundations of cyber technologies as an emerging technology for warfare. And for this reasons, I find his writings and insights quite convincing. Now, a consequence of this type of technological, moral, philosophical reasoning is a growing confusion, he says, about ideas of what is good for society, with excitements about what tools and technologies we can make for society. It prioritizes what he identified as a distinctly American fascination with tools, with how these technologies work, with their very technicity, over any ethical considerations about human society more generally. In his own words, he says, a key challenge of modernity is the worship of know-how as opposed to know what, or indeed know what for. That's to say, we tend to be inclined to, and here I quote again, to accept the superior dexterity of the machine decision without too much inquiry as to the motives and principles behind these. This, for him, was a myopic focus on know-how, on technicity, which produced a blind spot that comes always at the expense of our collective social benefit. Given that the know what for is how we identify what our collective purposes should be, is how we give meaning to a shared social and political space, this shifting in priorities is meaningful for the future of society. And so in a technological modernity, this normative question about purpose and ethicality then becomes folded into a technical jargon, and it becomes subsumed by processes and procedures to the point of obscurity. Now, unfortunately, some of these early voices like Wiener's and Anders and others are increasingly drowned out by these very hyperbolic narratives of the near magical capabilities of artificial intelligence, but really I do think we would do well to take their concerns seriously as they do apply to what we do with lethal autonomous weapon systems and how we see them. So we have heard all about how these algorithmic and AI-enabled systems work throughout the day, and you are all experts on the matter, so there's no need for me to reiterate what kinds of systems we are talking about or what I'm concerned about, but I do think it is not just the fully autonomous weapon systems that should give pause for thought, but also those that provide kill recommendations or AI-enabled kill recommendations to human operators. I think it's really a sliding scale. They're not the same, but they're on a trajectory. And it's also perhaps worth noting at this point that various systems in which some AI-enabled target selection features are already in place and able to function with a more sophisticated degree of autonomy at this stage either heavily trialed or already in use. So in 2020, DARPA was flying this large trial mission of drone swarm and swarming tanks, which were tasked with the aim to track down terrorist suspects in an urban environment. So clear anti-personnel kind of the tasks. And that was just one of many such exercises that quite clearly signals that the Pentagon is determined to shift an increasing amount of decision-making, including targeting decision-making to machines. And of course, you will recall the Turkish autonomous drone system, the STM Kargu 2, which had made headlines in 2021 when a UN report on Libya mentioned that the drone system was used to hunt down and remotely engage one of the parties to the hostilities without requiring a data connection between the operator and the munition. And even though the details on this event are still quite scant and a bit fuzzy, if they are indeed true, and it was used in full autonomy mode to identify, track, and attack human targets, this would, at this stage, as far as I know, the first publicly documented anti-human, anti-personnel use of a lethal autonomous weapon system. So these systems are being developed, trialed, and increasingly integrated into operations. Although the US is by far not the only one, we know this, the respective states' position in the CCW discussions are instructive in this. It's the US I am focusing on here because, as it was used for drone use in counterterrorism operations, the US tends to set the tone for the modes of warfare to come. And if the US position at the CCW is anything to go by, the slide towards full autonomy is well and truly on. So, also to keep in mind that one of the primary goals in using AI for targeting operations is to make war faster and more lethal. The two clearly stated aims all over the place. The assumption is that an AI-enabled system can calculate context faster, more comprehensively, and is able to make decisions a lot more speedily than any human might be able to do. Secretary of the US Air Force, Frank Kendall, is quoted as saying, AI can significantly reduce the manpower-intensive tasks of manually identifying targets, shortening the kill chain, and accelerating the speed of decision-making, usually from minutes to seconds. Other suggestions, this time put forward by US Army General John Murray, among others, is that indeed, we need to take the human out of the loop. There's no necessity for any human control. We've already heard a little bit about terminology, how this is shifting. Indeed, keeping the human in the loop would impede the superior capacities of the technology and making these decisions just faster. So not only is it not necessary to have the human in the loop, but in fact, it's no good to have the human even close to the targeting loop when hundreds of lethal swarm systems are involved. So it's very difficult to maintain oversight. So more technology is needed for that. Now, to me, this represents a considerable shift in the narrative put forward by the US Department of Defense, and I've been working on this for quite a while. The DoD until recently had strongly emphasized that adequate human control via the 2012 issued and 2017 updated directive in critical targeting functions would always remain a requirement in the operation of autonomous weapon systems. So it's clear that the goalposts are now shifting quite considerably and quite quickly, and the concept of adequate human control becomes further and further removed from the targeting cycle. This shift is often justified. It requires a justification, and this justification is done by invoking a looming threat by Russia and China in taking the lead in developing military artificial intelligence, that we indeed find ourselves in an arms race in which we mustn't fall behind the competitor. Now, this ostensible arms race is also underwritten by an almost irrational belief in artificial intelligence as the inevitable future of most aspects of human life. So this faith in AI as a panacea does, however, overlook the fact that AI is indeed quite brittle. It is inherently error-prone. It is by default biased. Systems that employ AI for full kill chain are likely to be marred by incomplete data, inadequate data, low quality data, discrepant data, missing data. So in essence, inadequate for the highly variable and complex real world battlefield. It's often just kind of swept under the carpet, it seems. In addition to that, the AI industry, as far as I know, is perhaps not as rigorous as we are led to believe, or that we often assume. Data for AI is often mislabeled. Research in machine learning for AI is by far not as scientifically robust as it might appear from media accounts, and so on and so forth. Now, this condition will inevitably lead to faulty decisions, to misapplication of force, and other harmful errors. It's perhaps not so surprising when we think about the logic of AI, when we consider that artificial intelligence as such is underpinned what Matteo Pasquinelli calls a grammar of error. In other words, errors are built in. Limitations, approximations, fallacies, and vulnerabilities, as he says, are native to the AI paradigm. The artificiality of AI is also always an infidelity as it relates to our real lived world. So what AI conceptualizes as and works with as is a model of the world, an approximation of a perceived environment, calculated based on limited, curated, and always incomplete input data. Machine learning calculates the statistical distribution of a pattern, not the exact pattern. It can only ever be close enough. It must truncate that which doesn't fit, it has to press data into assorted categories and modes of classification, through which then an outcome can be achieved that is in the final instance actionable on the ground or in the real world. So Pasquinelli calls artificial intelligence as such a technique of information compression. He also calls it a statistical fiction, but it is produced in this always incomplete and only close enough way in the interest of speed and efficiency. And so if we take this line of reasoning seriously, it becomes clear that errors will be made and accidents will happen with the use of AI-enabled lethal autonomous systems, especially for human targeting. This much we know. It's a logical conclusion, if you will. I'll return to this question of the accident as an important issue of moral significance and towards the end of my comments. But this logic of machines, I think, is worth paying attention to. They are not conceived, nor do they exist in a vacuum just per se. They are always social, and they are always technical. Félix Guattari has said of machines, and that was also a while back, that they are hyper-concentrated forms of certain aspects of human subjectivity. So what kinds of aspects of human subjectivity do they encapsulate? And here I suggest we might want to look to the technology industry itself to better understand our present condition, given that Silicon Valley, at least in the US context, appears to be increasingly in the driving seat when it comes to dictating the rhythm and pace of military technological innovations, and indeed the cultural shift towards full autonomy and taking the human out. Now, there's a highly complex and firmly entwined relationship between Silicon Valley interests and military progress. Former Google CEO, now Washington advisor, Eric Schmidt, we've already come across his name earlier today, is driving this military AI agenda forward with scarcely mitigated enthusiasm, and his influence really has been on tour basically the last 3 years, can be felt in the relatively recent shift to prioritize speed and action and innovation as a core principle for the future of the US military. The dynamics of this relationship and the increasingly notable dominance of private sector rhetoric for military operations should give us pause for thought. So what happens when the military picks up the pace of the technology industry? What happens when Silicon Valley ideology of speed, agility, do now, fix later, and churning out products is becoming a dominant theme in warfare? So here, consider, for example, one of the most iconic, I suppose, and problematic technology companies after which many other companies have fashioned themselves, and that is, of course, Facebook, or Meta now. Now, Meta, Facebook, has built its business around the ethos that there is intrinsic value in getting products to market at speed, regardless of whether these technologies are fully fit for use. We are, of course, all aware of the motto, move fast and break things. Another of then Facebook, now Meta's slogans was, done is better than perfect. And this is the essence of the business practice. It's the hacker way, as Zuckerberg calls it. The technology sector must move fast. It's about winning the race to getting a product to market. And only by embracing this logic of mistake and error and just churning it out can coders move fast enough to gain an advantage over competitors. Shortcuts, post hoc fixes, are always justified with the understanding that mistakes can always be addressed later through updates, through upgrades, and so on. The mandate to embrace mistakes and errors is indeed valorized in this kind of narrative and idea, and the potential waste that is produced in this practice is made up for by the promise of high financial rewards for just a handful of successes. Overpromising is a feature of this kind of ethos. And so I'm suggesting that this mode of thinking is becoming attractive as an aspiration across industrialized nations, even as a mode of social, economic, political, and military organization. Act now, fix later. And so here it becomes really important that we look carefully who is making those products. And some of the companies that Kenneth pointed out today are instructive here as well. Who is making those products that are to be used in a military context? And I know that some of the papers will speak to this tomorrow in a bit more detail. I just want to briefly stress that the military AI market is enormously lucrative, and aggressive newcomers are moving in swiftly wherever there's a gap or a vacuum. Google, you will recall, decided not to renew its contractual involvement with Project Maven, for example, after widespread protests of its employees who didn't want to be associated with producing potentially lethal military applications. Well, Anduril, the military startup of the Oculus Rift founder, Lucky Palmer, moved in to fill some of the void in producing AI for the project. And it's those types of military startups that perhaps have fewer qualms about ethical considerations or, moral standing of targets. And Lucky Palmer himself, in an article, he quips that most of his engineers, they just want to engineer, they just want to get stuff done. And that suggests that, or implies that little else matters. Now, to be clear, technological innovations and military endeavors have long gone hand in hand. Norbert Wiener's innovations in communication theory were used for missile technology in his own time. The pioneers of AI almost all worked on mid-century military projects. And of course, the internet, came out of a military endeavor. Traditionally, it was the requirement of the military organizations that would set the pace and structure for technological innovation. And defense companies had previously worked in tandem with the military. It still happens, of course, to foster innovation. But increasingly, there's a shift, especially with those types of technology companies that adhere to the move fast and break things motto, if you will. And again, perhaps not surprising, Eric Schmidt has really been such a vocal advocate of making military processes and procedures much faster. In forging his ties with Washington, he has done extensive work in promoting his Silicon Valley worldview, where, and here I quote, advances in software and AI are the keys to figuring out almost any issue. For him and others, traditional processes and procurement procedures, for example, in military operations are far too slow. He appears determined to align the timeframes of action between the military world and the technology world in his push to modernize the US military. And his efforts seem to be bearing fruit. The technology worldview is finding its way into military and policy circles. Again, US Army, this time Chief of Staff General James McConville declared in early 2021 that the Army must become faster, both, and here I quote, as an institution developing new weapons, not in decades, but in a few years, and as a battlefield force, destroying enemies, firing artilleries, not minutes after spotting an enemy, but seconds. And similarly, and I'm just pulling out two examples, there are many more. Also last year, a senior fellow at the US think tank, the Center for New American Security, urged the Pentagon to take a leaf out of the software industry playbook if the Pentagon wants to become truly agile. He recommends the adoption of a concept from the software industry, agile development, for both acquisition and strategy. Now, agile software development, again, is built on a number of principles that foreground the dynamic and iterative process of getting a product to market. This means the product gets developed and delivered quickly and then refined and improved and adjusted and fine-tuned as time goes on. It says this should be the strategic priority or plan or way forward for the Pentagon, issue something quickly and work out the problems over time. Act now, fix later. Now, where this might work for a technological product, an ecosystem or a chatbot or what have you, this seems to me quite jarring for actions where the ethical stakes are so patently high as in warfare. The technology industry's influence, I think, and changing the culture on autonomous killing with AI systems is perhaps best illustrated by another project that Eric Schmidt was involved, and that is the National Security Commission on AI. It has already been mentioned, which was issued again 2021 in March. This report presents the Commission's strategy for winning the AI era. And it's the result of a prolonged period of discussions and consultations with various stakeholders, many from the technology sector, but also the military, of course. Recommendations in this report are very clear. The DoD must act now to integrate AI into its critical functions, existing systems, exercises, war games, and so on, to become an AI-ready force by 2025. The fact that AI compresses decision times from minutes to seconds, and this is likely to exceed any human cognitive capabilities, is not problematized. What is taken as a problem is the fact that the US government is still operating at human speed, not machine speed. This is seen as a considerable detriment to progress, and this is a disadvantage that must be overcome. The AI promise in the report is that a machine can indeed perceive, decide, and act more quickly in a more complex environment with more accurate results than a human. Now, leaving aside for a moment that most experts that I know agree that no AI system could operate reliably in a complex conflict environment in this manner at this stage, and dare I say probably also not in 3 years' time. It's clear to see how human reasoning and decision-making are deliberately sidelined, increasingly sidelined in this report. And it was shortly after this report was released that a flurry of news reports in which the narrative about humans far away from the targeting loop rather than on the loop began to shift. Now, where the technology sector dictates the pace and culture of innovation, military organizations must adjust. Silicon Valley startup culture operates at a much faster pace than the structurally complex, highly bureaucratic, and decidedly hierarchical lines of decision-making typical of military organizations. And it operates with much less concern for ethical implications that arise in the use of new and emerging technologies. Prioritized as a core value is innovation and the development of ever more intricate know-how as a clear stand-in for know what for, to use Wiener's term. I'm just going to check the chat just in case I've been going on for hours. This is always possible. Okay. So there is then a clear and mounting tension between the pace and ideology of technological innovation and our human institutions, which provide the foundations for social, political, and also military practices. By nature and design, the law as an institution, for example, and other human social institutions and political institutions is a lot slower than the venture capitalist-driven business cycles of the technology industry and the demands for innovation in the technology industry. So when the military adopts this pace of change, innovation for its practices, ethical and legal oversight over lethal practices in military operations necessarily suffer, right? There's no space for that, really. It's not built into this business cycle. To better grasp the broader impact of the digital military infrastructure we are building, we must then take the logic of the technologies and the industries that produce these technologies seriously. There's always more to a technology than its functioning as a mere tool. This insight is really not new. Most of you know this. Critical theorists of technology in the 1950s and 60s locate technological rationality at the core of modern social and political life. In such accounts, technology is always understood as a logic of organization and control. So it has a longer history, not as a means, but as an environment and a way of life, to quote Andrew Feenberg here. And so where certain technologies become more pervasive, so does then the logic of their inner workings, as artificial intelligence and digital technologies are dissolved into our social, political, and military institutions. The structural and logical signature of the technology or grammar of the technology becomes a substrate, becomes an infrastructure, which mediates and directs ideas and actions along its own protocols or functional lines. And this includes normative ideas about what we should be doing as society. So within the logic of AI computation, normative judgments about desirable actions and practices are rendered or refracted, if you will, through the lens of technological processes and business practices. It's not the human that defines, or humans collectively define horizons of possibility. It's the computer and its industry, or the industry and its computers. And so here I want to just very briefly come back to the issue of accidents. When technologics supersede human deliberation, if you will, harmful outcomes, or human deliberation, or when technologics as policies supersede human deliberation, harmful outcomes become folded into the technological practice as accidents, right? These accidents happen, they must happen. This becomes an excessive innovation. It becomes the cost of innovation, if you will. These accidents, if we can even call them that, in turn, kind of stand outside the realm of ethical deliberations in a kind of a moral void, often seen as an aberration, an exception, even though the error, the mistake, the fallacies with AI technology is in fact always implicit. So it's the very signature of the technology to be iterative, always in need of fixing and improving, and it's this very signature of the industries out of which this technology comes. So we might acknowledge then that this implicit accident that will happen is a new form of collateral damage, but one that remains entirely invisible as such. Patricia Owens has an excellent article, it's a few years back, on the status of the accident in warfare and how it relates to technologies. And she notes that the meaning of the accident is never a given in war. It's always created. It's always a decision to label a harmful event, usually with the understanding of no or limited fault attached to it. But social and ideological aims always play a role in attaching such label and casting the accident as accident rather than something entirely foreseeable. This condition is, of course, amplified or exacerbated with lethal AI technologies, especially in human targeting and their black box decision-making at speed. This raises moral questions of utmost urgency for the use, or for the debates on the use of AI-enabled lethal autonomous weapon systems is clear. The Silicon Valley ethos, move fast and break things, would be a very tragic and callous motto for military operations. It sidelines ethics entirely as having no place in the accelerated action loop. It matters, however, that for such horrendous human activities as warfare, we talked about this earlier, decisions over life and death should be difficult, they should be painful, and should adhere to slow and stringent demands for deliberation. Taking a life should not be easy, or indeed a systematic decision. And I'll come to a close here. The hyperbolic demands, well, the hyperbole, if you will, surrounding the demands for unimpeded development of AI as a panacea, as a solution for problems in virtually all domains of life is quite emblematic of a very myopic focus on this know-how, on the technicity, on techno solutions, if you will, over the knowing what purpose we're doing this for. An AI that can imitate human dance moves, an AI that promises to identify human emotions, an AI that can compose music, put together a painting, or indeed an AI system that can kill. These might constitute feats of great technicity, but to what end? We should ask ourselves. What is the purpose of such systems for society? What values do they support? And so I close. Oh no, it's not my closing slide. Okay, well, I come to a close by closing this all together, and I leave you with once again coming back to Norbert Wiener, who try to explain or try to illustrate America's peculiar and dominant obsession with technical know-how, Wiener recounts the story of a prominent US engineer who bought a mechanized piano. This purchase was made not out of love for piano music, but rather because of an overwhelming curiosity about the piano's mechanical functioning. Is the quote. Wiener tells us the story that for this gentleman, the play of piano was not a means of producing music, but a means of giving some inventor the chance of showing how skillful he was at overcoming certain difficulties in the production of music. This, he says, is an estimable attitude in a second-year high school student. How estimable it is in one of those on whom the whole cultural future of the country depends, I leave to the reader. Poignant question for our times indeed, a question on which I end now, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elke, for this very insightful and thought-provoking lecture, I thought. So